We're in progress.
Okay, good morning. Boker Tov, Shabbat Tov. Welcome back. Very brief last week, but we're feeling well, Baruch Hashem. We're back today, and we are continuing Tzurba Marabanan, volume 16, Hilchot Shabbat. We are again inching our way towards the beginning of Shabbat. We're still going to be discussing today Tosefet Shabbat, which is what we began 2 weeks ago. We spoke about the mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat, just very, very quickly, or Shei Prakim. In terms of what we discussed previously, we spoke about the Gemara learns out the mitzvah of Tosefet regarding Yom Kippur. We saw, according to, although the Rambam may only apply this mitzvah to Yom Kippur, other Rishonim certainly apply it to Yom Tov and to Shabbat as well. We spoke about precisely what Tosefet Shabbat means. When we take on Shabbat early, does that mean just in the sense of Isur Melacha? Or does that mean as well that we are really extending the Kedusha of Shabbat as if the night itself begins earlier? So we discussed that, some of the nafkaminas, how much time we have. We know, of course, the minhag in Yerushalayim is to begin candle lighting 40 minutes before Shkia. The earliest time we mentioned briefly that this is Plag Mincha. We'll discuss a little bit more today because it has to do with exactly what time we can begin davening and when we can light candles. And we spoke as well about the method of fulfilling Tosefet Shabbat, whether it has to be by speech or it's enough by thought. What happens if you have an entire community that accepts Shabbat early? Am I bound by them as well? Okay. If you don't remember any of the topics I've mentioned, I refer you to the book from page 143, more or less, until page 160.
Or the video.
Or the video. Okay. We're now going to begin page 161, a fascinating topic which comes up regarding early Shabbat. We know that on Shabbat itself, one could not ask another Jew to perform Melacha because another Jew is not allowed to perform Melacha on Shabbat. Even a non-Jew, however, who is allowed, is not bound to keep Shabbat. On Shabbat, under normal circumstances, and we'll get to these halachot, I think, a bit later on, but under normal circumstances, we cannot ask even a non-Jew to perform Melacha for us on Shabbat. There are exceptions. What's called shvut to shvut, b'makom mitzvah. It is a rabbinic prohibition to ask a non-Jew to perform melacha. So if you were to ask a non-Jew, that in itself is a rabbinic prohibition. To perform a rabbinic prohibition, still forbidden. But if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, if it's for the sake of great need, etc., there are exceptions. But the general default position is that we cannot ask anyone to perform melacha for us on Shabbat. Now, what happens if I've accepted early Shabbat? Okay, the case is it's Friday afternoon, it's still light outside. So after Plag Mincha, I came to the upstairs minyan, summer, and I've now accepted Shabbat. I'm walking home, it's still light outside, and I see somebody on their way to the downstairs minyan. They haven't yet Davening Mincha, they haven't yet accepted Shabbat. They have Davening Mincha, it's irrelevant, but they have not accepted Shabbat. And I suddenly remember I forgot to turn on the hot plate, or I forgot to leave the lights on, or whatever it is, whatever melacha. Am I now permitted to ask a fellow Jew to perform melacha when I've accepted Shabbat, but they have not yet accepted Shabbat, right? So on the one hand, you might say, well, it's already Shabbat. For me, I've already accepted Shabbat. I can't do it the same way that I can't ask a non-Jew to perform melacha. On the other hand, it's not Shabbat for them yet. There is absolutely no prohibition for them to perform melacha. So what is the case? That's what we're discussing. Now, the Rashba, source number 35, the Gemara does not address this case directly. There is another case which the Gemara addresses, and from here, the Rashba learns, it's brought by Tosefet as well, learns a fascinating halacha. The case which the Gemara discusses, and I don't think we actually have it in the sources, it's alluded to in the footnote number 26, but it talks about a case where, let's read footnote number 26, on page 161. So it says over there in the Gemara that the Gemara permits Reuven to ask Shimon to guard Reuven's produce if it's inside Shimon's tchum. Essentially, the case is like this. The case is where we have a tchum, a limit as to of alpayim amot, 2,000 amot outside beyond the city limits. That is where I can walk through on Shabbat. I'm not allowed to go further than that. So where Reuven has got produce, got fruit that is outside of his tchum, he's not allowed to go there on Shabbat. Now Shimon, who is based in a different place, it is within his tchum, and he is allowed to go there. So the Gemara says that Reuven can ask Shimon to go to guard his produce on Shabbat, without getting into the technicalities of it. But essentially, what the Gemara says is that for one person it's permitted, for another person it's forbidden. So the person for whom it's currently forbidden is allowed to ask the person for whom it's currently permitted to perform that action. And from there, the Rashba learns, source number 35, he says, Meha Shaminu, the Yisrael shekibel alav Shabbat, kodem shechashecha. Okay, again, I cannot stress enough that we are talking about a case where you have accepted early Shabbat. If it's after nightfall, if it's Shabbat for everybody, this is obviously irrelevant. But you have accepted early Shabbat before nightfall. Mutar lomar li'Yisrael lasot melacha plonit. He can ask somebody else who not yet accepted Shabbat to perform the melacha for him. Because it is permitted for the one who's performing it. There's absolutely, it's not Shabbat for him yet. There is absolutely no prohibition. And therefore, says the Shulchan Aruch, source number 36, he says, Yesh Omrim, brings Yesh Omrim, but this to be the accepted ruling. Shemi shekibel alav Shabbat kodem shechashecha. Somebody who accepted early Shabbat, mutar lomar liYisrael chavero lasot lo melacha. You can ask somebody else, obviously, who has not yet accepted Shabbat, to perform melacha for you. Okay. Quite a chiddush, but that is the halacha.
No, let me get that straight. You're not allowed to ask the goy to do the melacha. But you can ask the king to do the melacha.
So again, you're asking a good question. You're asking a good question. What's the difference here? Because what's the case? Are you asking if at that time you could ask an unju to do? That's a separate question. Meaning like this: when it's Shabbat, when it's definitely Shabbat, you can't ask anybody to do a melacha, not even an unju. So are you asking if you've accepted Shabbat early at that time, could you ask a non-Jew to? So seemingly, if it's at that time, if you're allowed to ask a Jew, maybe you could ask a non-Jew as well. But let's see. The Mishnah Berurah says, number 37, he says, "Keivan shenachaver mutar ein yisur amira shayach b'zeh." The yisur amira does not apply here at all. And if you turn over the page, see number 38, says the Shemirat Shabbat Kilchata. He says, "Bein ha'isha mekabelet et haShabbat b'adlakat nerot, ubein ha'yachid ha'mekabla al yedei tefila or al yedei dibur acher." Essentially, anybody who has accepted Shabbat early, or shegmar b'libo lekabel Shabbat, v'terem higia hashat bein hashmashot, it's before bein hashmashot, mutar lomar lahem lomar liYisrael acher. You can ask another Jew, sheterem kibel alav et haShabbat, who has not yet accepted Shabbat, la'asot avoram kol davar. Afilu davar sheyesh b'asiyato mishum isur Torah, even something which includes an isur Torah, right? Asking them to plug in the hot plate or whatever it is. Obviously, this is where the entire community has not yet accepted Shabbat, as we discussed last time. Yeter al ken, tzibur ha'maktim litpalel Shabbat u'litpalel tefillat aravit mib'od yom miplag mincha ve'en. So we have an entire congregation that has now accepted Shabbat and has davened early. Mutar lehem lomar liYisrael shemitpalel bebeit hakneset acher shetelem kiblu b'ot haShabbat. You can ask another Jew, davens in a different minyan, or in our example, right? Somebody from the upstairs, somebody who's on that particular week is davening upstairs or is davening downstairs when the minyanim are at different times. La'asot avoram kol davar, can ask them to do anything. Afilo yesh b'asiyatam mishum isur Torah. The truth is, I bet your question, David, that bein hashmashot, that bein hashmashot would be anything which is prohibited by a shvut, which is midrabanan. For the sake of a mitzvah, certainly you'd be allowed to do it. At that time, you'd be allowed to ask a non-Jew to perform it for you. We saw previously the case of asking a non-Jew to light a candle for you. But the Magen Avraham brought about saying a bracha. So this is beforehand. This is before nightfall. After nightfall, it's different. After nightfall, you can't ask a Jew, you can't ask a non-Jew at all. But the chiddush over here is that when I've accepted Shabbat early, and there are other Jews around who have not yet accepted Shabbat, I don't have to go asking a non-Jew to do it. I can ask them to perform that melacha for me. Yeah, Jim.
This isn't clear to me, but if a woman lights candles, she accepts Shabbos at the household,
yeah,
and the husband hasn't yet gone to shul, happens all the time.
Yeah.
And she realizes that a light was left on, a flame, she can ask her husband.
Correct.
Because he's going to not accept with her candle lighting, he's going to shul.
Exactly. The question was, if the woman lights candles, so she has accepted Shabbat, again, it's before Shkia, the husband has not yet accepted Shabbat, the husband can perform whatever melacha is required on behalf of his wife as well, that is acceptable. The question which we need to discuss, which we will discuss later on, is if the husband goes to the early minyan, and he is accepting Shabbat early, do the candles have to be lit by the time that he accepts Shabbat? Is it going to work in that direction as well? We'll get there. We'll get there. I know I mentioned this a few weeks ago and people said they didn't want to hear the answer, but we're going to get there. Don't worry.
Somewhere you are.
To what extent is there enough between these people with young Toshini and 10 people to do things for them on the Yom?
So I don't understand the question again.
Somebody's keeping a second day over here, right?
Right.
Wants us to like put them in taxi cabs and buy them lunch and all kinds of other things. Right? To what extent is it parallel? Because there's no chibur and like nobody else is. It's not time for anybody else.
Right.
Right. But for them, it's certainly it's kind of is it a parallel case or is it a whole different set of?
So I think there is a certain parallel. The question was asked: if somebody who is a ben chutz la'aretz, who is in Eretz Yisrael and is keeping second day Yom Tov, without getting into that now, whether they should be keeping a second day or not, or who's considered ben chutz la'aretz, because that is a whole sugya in and of itself. But the question was: can now somebody who is a ben chutz la'aretz, who is now keeping Yom Tov, ask a Jew who is a ben Eretz Yisrael to perform Melacha ne'abav? So there is certainly a parallel here. It may be even easier in that case because they may not be required at all. But yeah, okay. Let's stick with Shabbos. Shabbos is complicated enough before we get to Yom Tov. So now there is a big question, a big discussion here regarding Mincha, and when this comes up, this can be very relevant. In many shuls in Yerushalayim, we have the 40 minutes, so we have a bit of extra time. So it's easier. Usually, you daven Mincha and you're finished before the time comes of Kabbalat Shabbat, of the Tosefet Shabbat. Again, the Tosefet Shabbat, which we've been discussing, is before Shkia. There are many places where Mincha will be after candle lighting, and therefore Mincha will be really at the last minute. By the time you finish Davening Mincha, or maybe even by the time you start Davening Mincha, it's already after Shkia, and therefore if you're going to Daven Mincha and then finish, you don't have any time left for your Tosefet Shabbat. So what does a person do? Is one required? If, on the other hand, we say we don't want to miss the mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat, so we want to make sure that we accept Shabbat upon ourselves, but then can you still have a mincha afterwards if you've already accepted Shabbat? So
I don't think you can daven a weekday Shmona Esrei and you already accept Shabbos.
Well, that's exactly the question. That's exactly the problem we have. So the best thing to do, the best solution before any of this is you make sure that you daven mincha with enough time. That you finish mincha, there's time, you can accept Shabbat, and it's before Shkia. You still have a few minutes. That is obviously mitzvah min hamuvcha. But many times we know that reality is less than ideal. So says the Shulchan Aruch, source number 39. We're on page 163. He says, "Imanav v'kibel Shabbat imahem, eino yachol litpalel tfilat chol." We discussed last week how and when a person accepts Shabbat. Let's say a person accepts Shabbat with Baruch Hu. It seems to be what the Shulchan Aruch here is referring to. So if a person answered Baruch Hu, and therefore you accepted Shabbat, so eino yachol litpalel tfilat chol, you can no longer daven the weekday tefillah. And if you have a daven mincha, you would then be required to daven Mariv twice in terms of tashlumin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, right? A person accepted on Shabbat upon themselves. How can you then say Shabbat and then say Tzchol? Therefore, there is no way that one is able to daven mincha after that. So says the Shemrat Shabbat.
Women with they light candles, they really shouldn't be davening mincha. They should try to daven before, even though the husband is going to daven.
Oh, so we'll get to that. But essentially, based on what we discussed last week, that's correct. Meaning, if when you light candles, you're accepting upon yourself Shabbat. So certainly, l'katchila, one should daven mincha first, and then light the candle. Says the Shemrat Shabbat number 41. He says, we'll see here, there may be certain exceptions to this. He says, a person comes to shul, right? And he sees, you can work out that Tfilat Shemona is going to finish only when we get to Shkia, or even later. He says, better than to daven by yourself. Without it, okay, that is one approach. The approach, no, you should rather daven even mincha without a minyan, but make sure you can keep Tosefet Shabbat. Not all poskim agree. The Tzitz Eliezer over the page, number 42, he says, "Benidonenu shekiber alav Shabbat biyachid v'nizkar la'achar miken shelo itpalel mincha she'achol shapir itpalel dena mincha shalchu." So the Tzitz Eliezer seems to understand that you could, there is a way to accept Shabbat and then still daven mincha. This again relates to conceptually what we began when we say Tosefet Shabbat. If we say that Tosefet Shabbat means we are essentially extending Shabbat all the way to the time that I accept it. So it's Shabbat for everything. It means I can't do Melacha, means I can eat my meal, means I can't have a Mincha, I can't do anything. If we say, however, that the Tosefet is just Tosefet in the sense of I am now extending the fact that I cannot do Melacha, but it's not completely Shabbat yet, it's Tosefet Shabbat. So maybe therefore there's room to Davening Mincha. So says the Tzitz Eliezer, in an extenuating circumstance, the person knows they're going to come to shul and the minyan is the only minyan there is only going to be Davening Mincha. It's going to be after Shkia. So you accept Shabbat, Tosefet Shabbat for everything except for Mincha, and then you can still daven. Chacham Ovadia, source number 43, he says, Rav Ovadia Yosef, נראה שהמאחל לפני מנחה בערב שבת, אף אם מסיים מנחה אחר שקיעה, לא ביטל מצוות תוספת. says, כיוון שבת במלאכה, similar to what we just explained. He says, if you, so long, the Tosefet Shabbat means you have not, you're not doing Melacha. So you've fulfilled Tosefet Shabbat in the sense you're not doing Melacha, and you can still have a Mincha. He says, אפילו אם רוצה לקבל תוספת שבת בפה מלא, but even if a person wants to accept Shabbat with verbally, יכול להתנות שאינו מקבל שבת אלא למלאכה ולא לשאר דברים. He says a person could stipulate that I'm accepting Shabbat for the sake of Shabbat, for the sake of Isur Melacha, but not for the sake of Mincha.
That includes women who light candles and then daven Mincha.
Yeah. שכיוון שעיקר מצוות התוספת היא שביתה ממלאכה אסורה בשבת, since we say that the main part of Tosefet Shabbat is not doing Melacha, and Tfilat Mincha mafkia mitzvah Tosefet. Therefore, Davening Mincha would not uproot that mitzvah of Tosefet. So that's the opinion of Rav Ovadia. One more opinion, which we'll see here, actually maybe two more, and then we'll summarize everything. So Pnei Halacha, source number 44, he says like this. We'll just read in bold. He says, the widespread custom, שאם השקיעה מקרבת ועדיין לא התפללו מנחה, מקבלים תוספת שבת ואחר כך מתפללים מנחה לחור. So he says that this is the, since essentially you're accepting Shabbat mentally, Tosefet Shabbat mentally, then you can still carry on a Davening Mincha. And here the question was asked. He says, גם לנשים מותר בדיעבד להתפלל מנחה אחר הדלקת נרות. Okay, he says, but it got late and you didn't have enough time, and then you can still daven mincha after הדלקת נרות. אבל לכתחילה, מי שיודע שהציבור מתאחר להתפלל מנחה, מוטב שיתפלל מנחה ביחיד, אחר כך יקבל שבת. Okay, so he says maybe a bit of a middle ground approach. He says, but it's okay. If you know this is going to be the case, rather daven earlier. So essentially what we've seen is this. We've seen there is a machloket. Ideally, everybody agrees. Ideally, we want Tosefet Shabbat to be everything about Shabbat. We don't want to daven mincha when we've already accepted Shabbat. It's making a bit of a kilayim. So therefore, if it's possible, and if a person is able to daven mincha first, and then and then accept Shabbat with enough time before Shkia, daven mincha first, and then light candles, that is ideal. Everybody would agree. There is no machlok. The machloket is what happens under extenuating circumstances. I'm sure it's never happened to anybody in this room that it's a Friday afternoon and it's getting late and not everything is ready, an hour before. Never happened to anybody here. Never happened to me. But apparently there are people to whom it happens. Okay, and so in such a situation, what does one do? So there are those who say you cannot daven mincha after you've accepted Shabbat. So for a man who's normally careful to daven with the minyan, daven by yourself before you go to shul, and then make sure you accept the Shabbat. However, there are those who say you can accept Shabbat without the inyan of mincha, or you can even accept Tosefet Shabbat and stipulate that you still have to daven mincha, and therefore, if it's getting late, right, the case of the lighting candles, if we're very, very close to Shkia, you're not going to have enough time to daven mincha and then light candles before Shkia. It might be a safek. So there, clearly, you would light candles first. Make sure that you have before Shkia, before Tosefet, and then a daven mincha. But there are enough opinions how to rely on in that case. What's that?
Like you have to do that with a denying that I'm going to light the candles now, but I'm also going to daven mincha weekday mincha.
Yeah. So there are those who say that it's enough and you can do it. And there are those who say you should stipulate that you're accepting Shabbat with the express purpose of not performing Melacha, but not for the sake of, not for me. Yeah.
When you daven for Parnasa, I always feel very strange. Actually, really like to daven for Parnasa, even though I'm davening with the Mincha, so I don't daven that.
Some.
It's
Minhag Yisrael Kodesh, meaning if there is a.
it's not me.
Oh, you're saying wait. You're saying in the
You don't daven for Panos on Shabbat.
Right.
But if I'm davening weekday mincha,
Yeah.
after I lit candles, so I always think that I should leave that out.
You should say it. You
Say
should.
it anyway.
You should say it. Yeah.
Okay.
Because if you're leaving out a bracha, then you're not saying the full
I'm not
Shemona.
leaving out Shabbat. I'm leaving out the extra insert.
Oh, an extra insert. You can leave it. Yeah.
Leave it out or put it in.
You can leave it out. You can leave it out. Okay. I misunderstood the question originally. Okay. I'm sorry. All right. So let's talk about, the timing of Mincha and Mariv. Essentially, when we try and accept early Shabbat, this is now here, for example, in this Beit Knesset, when we have early Shabbat throughout the summer months, so we're very careful to make sure that Mincha is going to be before Plag Mincha, and then Kabbalat Shabbat will be afterwards. There are other places that are not as careful. In Chutz La'aretz, for example, it's very, very common that because when you have places where you're davening Mincha long after or after Plag Mincha, you're davening Mincha after Plag Mincha together with Kabbalat Shabbat. That is not so straightforward. Let's see. Again, just to give you a sense, we saw the times on page 167, right, when we talk about Plag Mincha. So again, in Yerushalayim, it's generally 6:15, 6:30, around about there. It doesn't get too late. But if you look at the times for London, for example, in June, Plag Mincha can be 7:35, meaning that's the earliest time that you can accept Hadlakat Nerot over there. You see 9:04. So it gets very, very difficult to get the timing right. But let's see. So let's understand where this timing comes from. We mentioned previously Plag Mincha. This is an hour and a quarter before the end of the day, probably an hour and a quarter before Shkia. Again, based on Sha'ot Zmaniyot. So all of this is based on the Gemara Brachot. Source number 47. The Gemara Brachot tells us that Midrav Matzle Shel Shabbat be'elev Shabbat mi'ba'od yom. The Gemara says that Rav would pray of Shabbat on Erev Shabbat. And essentially, he would pray the tefillah of Shabbat on Friday during the day. Okay. Early Shabbos. Shema mina halakha Rabbi Yehuda. And the question is, who do we go like? Does that mean he holds like Rabbi Yehuda or he holds like the Chachamim? This is a machloket that we have in the Gemara Brachot between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim relating to when the night begins. Do we say, and when you can daven Mariv? The opinion of Chachamim is that the night begins at night, and that's when you can daven Mariv, only after nightfall. According to Rabbi Yehuda, from Plag Mincha, which is an hour and a quarter before night, that is the time that begins when you can daven Mariv. Now, obviously, it's implicit here. The time when we can daven Mariv, we can no longer daven Mincha. So, according to Chachamim, you can daven Mincha all day long, right until Shkia, let's say. And Mariv, you can only daven after night. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you can daven Mincha until Plag Mincha, meaning the last hour and a quarter of the day. You can no longer daven Mincha anymore. You can daven Mariv. Okay, those are the two different opinions. And the Gemara says that Kamar Avid or Kamar Avid. It doesn't say here, but it says that you can follow either one of those opinions so long as you are consistent. So long as you don't do Tartei D'Satre. Meaning if a person is going to daven Mincha after Plag Mincha, that works according to Chachamim. But then you have to wait until nightfall to daven Mariv. Alternatively, if you want to daven Mariv before nightfall after Plag Mincha, so then you have to daven Mincha earlier. But if in that hour and a quarter between Plag Mincha and nightfall, if you daven Mincha and Mariv in that time, so then Mincha that works according to Chachamim, but Mariv that works according to Rabbi Yehuda, but it's two different opinions. Is it day or is it night? It doesn't work. And therefore, generally speaking, we should not do that. When the Gemara says, by the way, you can follow whichever, it's a very strange thing. The Gemara doesn't machrir. Normally, we have a machloket between Chachamim, Rabbi Yehuda, whoever it is. So we say halakha follows opinion A or opinion B. And Shulchan Aruch says halakha follows opinion A or opinion B, whichever one you want. What does that mean, whichever one you want? So there are those who say it means a person has to choose one and be consistent for their entire life. Right? You follow one opinion, you always follow that opinion. There are others who say it means every day. On a particular day, I can follow Rabbi Yehuda, I can follow Chachamim, but I can't do both. Now the problem is that in many places in Chutz La'aretz, especially places where it gets dark very, very late. You have Mincha Ma'ariv during the week and on Shabbos, where you'd have a Mincha Ma'ariv together after Plag Mincha, and it's a complete Tata Desatra. It's a complete contradiction in terms. So let's see, again, in Eretz Israel, it's less common that this happens. And this is one of our, myriad proofs that Jews are meant to live in Eretz Israel and not in other places. But in any event, so yeah, we see that it says that Rav on Shabbat and on Friday he would daven Ma'ariv early during the day. So says the Gemara, that means Shema Mina Lachak Rabbi Yehuda. That sounds like he holds like Rabbi Yehuda. Then it says Adrabah Mid Ravuna Rabbanan Rav Umatzle Ad Urta Shema Mina Ena Lachak Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so the question is, does he hold like Rabbi Yehuda normally, or is Shabbat a different case? Meaning, even if we say that during the week we can only daven Mincha after nightfall, we could still daven Ma'ariv early on Shabbat. Maybe there's a different reason why on Friday night we can daven early for Shabbat. So let's see. Says the Shulchan Aruch, number 48, top of page 169. Makdimin litparel alvit yoter mibimot hachol. Says on Friday night we daven Ma'ariv earlier, not just because we're all tired and we're going to fall asleep. He says, בפלג המנחה יכול להדליק ולקבל שבת בתפילת ערב. So from Plag Mincha, that is the time at which one can accept Shabbat. That is the time which one can daven Ma'ariv. So says the Magen Avraham, who's one of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim. He says, Sarechiyun, the big Maram, Rinan Midatzalei Rav Shel Shabbat, Be'elev Shabbat, Shema Minad Alachak Rabbi Yehuda. Right, at first, when the Gemara says that Rav would daven early on Friday night, that means that's a proof that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. So that seems to suggest mashma that Rabbanan asur, the Rabbanan who normally say you can only daven after nightfall would say the same thing on Friday night. So that's what it would seem to be. That's his question. So in source number 50, he resolves the question and says, Bahag, one of the Rishonim. He says, V'rav achisava. Shabbat Elif Shabbat Matzli. Klomar Mosifin Mechol HaKodesh. He says, no. You have to understand, this is different to the machloket during the week between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim, because we have a mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat, because we can accept Shabbat early, so we can daven early together. If you're extending the day, and you're saying that the night actually begins earlier, so then you can daven Ma'ariv earlier, even though normally you would wait until nightfall. And therefore he says, Sarech Lomar L'Didei, the Me'ekar Avabayna Mipshat Me'lav D'Alachat Rabbi Yehuda. Now in bold, Aval HaMaskana. Ibai Avid Kamar V'chule Rashai Lakdim Be'erev Shabbat Af Al Pi Shebachol Oser K'Rabbanan. In other words, if a person is careful always during the week to wait until nightfall to Paskan like Chachamim and to only daven Ma'ariv after when it is dark, so even then a person is still allowed to, according to this opinion, daven Ma'ariv earlier on Friday night because of the mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat. That is one reason to differentiate. He brings another couple actually. Very, very interesting. If you turn over the page, source number 51, maybe I'll just say it outside without reading. How do we know when we are allowed to daven each of the tefillot? The tefillot are corresponding to the korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash. So Shachrit corresponds to the Tamid Shabbat, the morning Korban Tamid. Mincha corresponds to the afternoon Korban Tamid. And Ma'ariv corresponds to the limbs and the fats and whatever that was left over that were burnt on the Mizbeach at night. Now on Shabbat, those things that were left over, you still brought the Korban Tamid on Shabbat. But the extra limbs and fats, etc., were not burnt on the altar. They were done on Friday afternoon, before Shabbat. So therefore, says the Magen Avraham, it therefore makes sense. If the time for Ma'ariv corresponds to the time things were done in the Beit HaMikdash, this particular part of the service was done earlier on Shabbat. And therefore, maybe there are those who say, the Aruch HaShulchan even says that it's better on Friday to daven before nightfall than it would be after night. But that is another explanation. So we saw either because of Tosefet Shabbat or because of corresponding to the Korbanot, that we would be allowed to daven Ma'ariv earlier on Friday. And a third explanation brought in number 52, he brings the Mordechai. And the Mordechai writes, right? What we explained is that that when the Gemara says you can follow this opinion or you can follow that opinion in terms of Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim, that according to many that means you have to be consistent your entire life, which one you follow. But the Mordechai says each day you can choose. On each day you have to be consistent. So sometimes you follow this, sometimes you follow that, and therefore based on that even if you normally daven Ma'ariv later, on Erev Shabbat, you can daven early. Okay, the point is, the thing we have to remember, source number 52, the last line in bold, he says, Sarech lezahem, Erev Shabbat, lepalel mincha, kodem plaga mincha. You still need to daven mincha itself before plaga mincha. So again, so it's not a contradiction in terms on that day. Now, what do we do with the fact that there are many communities in Chutz La'aretz that throughout the summer months have at a time, sometimes it's funny, sometimes you walk into a shul and they have the davening times on the board, and it will say, mincha, maybe during the week, not necessarily on Shabbat, but it'll say mincha Ma'ariv at 6:30, and then mincha Ma'ariv at 7:30. How do you daven mincha after Ma'ariv? Again, it's different minyanim, but we run into this problem. And you'll have on Shabbat, so it might be throughout the summer months that it's consistent that every week Kabbalat Shabbat is at Mincha and Kabbalat Shabbat is at 7:15. I think in London that was the way it was. In some shuls, right, 7:15 or 7:30 every week. But Plag Mincha is beforehand, before 7:30. So how do we resolve this? Says the Mishnah Berurah, source number 53. He says, Yesh Shomrim, the B'tzibur yesh la'akal itpalel ma'alev mibod yom, af im itpalel mincha achar Plag Mincha. So there are those, again, this is a limud zchut. This is not lekat chila. This is certainly not the ideal way. But he says there are those who are lenient, that in a community, an individual, by the way, an individual certainly should not be doing this. That's why, so when we had during the years of COVID, when everybody was davening at home, so again, in London, this was a big chiddush for people, because again, there's manei hayom, it gets in the winter, it gets dark so early, in the summer, it gets dark so late, and it's pretty much impossible to actually follow these things. But so then we were telling people that if you're davening at home, you have to be very careful, davening before Plag Mincha, after Plag Mincha, etc. But if you're davening together with the tzibur, there are those who allow it. But essentially based on the svara that it's going to be difficult, it's going to be a Torah, people are not going to be able to come together. You're going to tell them to come at this time and go home and come back, and people aren't going to be able to. Therefore, there is room for leniency that the mitzvah of tefillah b'tzibur is therefore going to trumpet in this case. And that's what he says. He says, even though you've davened mincha after Plag Mincha, this is the only way you can daven tefillah b'tzibur. Then there are those who allow it. He says now in bold, Nirali, Shnabura is not happy with this advice. He says you can rely on it, I think, only when it is an extenuating circumstance, and even then, Ma'ariv should be davened at least ben hashmashot, at least it should be after Shkia, but nonetheless, that last line, everybody would agree. That Kriyat Shema, you need to go back and say it once it's certainly after nightfall. That's what we do here. We announce every week during the summer that people should go home and remember to say Kriyat Shema. Same thing for Sfat HaOmer, by the way. But Kriyat Shema is the mitzvah d'oraita. So again, another explanation here on source number 54. This is Rabbi Baruch Simon, who is a Rosh Yeshiva Ritz, YU, and he also defends this practice of, like we said, in Chutz La'aretz, where many communities are davening together after Plag Mincha. He says, "Ayen magen Avraham sheochech midivra bahag, ulam magen Avraham katav, she'afilu achi yizaher beoto yom, היינו בערב שבת שיפלל מנחה קודם פלג המנחה, שמצוות תוספת שבת אינה מתרת תרתי דסתרי בחד יום." Again, he explained the Magen Avraham we saw in the name of the Bahag, who says because of the mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat, we can daven Ma'ariv earlier, but we should still be careful to daven Mincha before Plag Mincha, so it's not a tarte desatre, contradiction in terms. Ulam, nonetheless, אפשר להציע שקהילות שמתפללים מנחה מעריב בתרתי דסתרי בימות החמה, those communities that do daven Mincha and Ma'ariv together after Plag Mincha in the summer months, נוסף דברי חיים, שכתב שמשום תלכת לציבור. So one justification, which is what the Mishnah Berurah alluded to, is תלכת לציבור. It's going to be difficult to get the congregation together at another time, and therefore they can daven. Maybe there's another reason that we can be lenient. He says based on the Bahag, right over the page, top of 172. He says, right, what's the problem? The problem is we're saying, why can you not daven Mincha Ma'ariv together after Plag Mincha? Because you have to decide. If it's day, you can daven Mincha. If it's night, you can daven Ma'ariv, but it can't be day and night together in that period of time. Shabbat, there's a difference. It's not just to do what time of day it is. It's the fact that there's Tosefet Shabbat. It's the fact that I'm accepting Shabbat. So I could say like this: when I daven Mincha, it's still Friday. But when I daven Mariv, because I've accepted Shabbat, it's not Friday anymore. It's Shabbat. So therefore, again, the Magen Avraham did not like that, but that could be an idea fundamentally why we could allow, or what we could rely on for those communities who do daven Mincha Mariv together. As we said, here we are very particular to make sure that we daven Mincha before Plag Mincha and then Kabbalat Shabbat afterwards, so there is no question. Now, the question you were hoping I would avoid. Must the wife accept Shabbat at the same time as her husband? Right? This is the question. The husband comes to shul, davens the early Shabbat, and do we have to make sure that by the time when the husband is in shul saying L'chadodi or Baruch or whatever point we say Shabbat is accepted, then at that point the candles have to be lit at home. So predictably, you all knew this, it's a machlok. Okay, source number 55, the Igrot Moshe of Moshe Feinstein, he writes like this. He says, he says, it would seem that, no, that the wife is not bound by the husband's acceptance of Shabbat in this case. In the same way that we said that if the husband is at home watching his wife light candles, that he does not yet accept Shabbat. In the same way that if you have a number of communities within a certain area, and one shul accepts, even within the same shul, that the upstairs minyan accept Shabbat, those in the downstairs minyan are not yet bound by it. So the same way he says, one is not bound by the other. Right? The fact that the husband now has accepted Tosefet Shabbat to forbid him from performing Melacha, he can't now forbid somebody else from performing Melacha, even his wife. One of the different conceptual way underpinnings of what we say, what are we doing with Tosefet Shabbat? One of the explanations is that Tosefet Shabbat is essentially like a neder. It's like making a vow. So when I say I already makabel alei Shabbat, okay, before Plag Mincha on Friday, so that doesn't mean anything. But if one was to say that, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar to accepting a neder, making a vow upon myself that I cannot do Melacha. Do that for myself, I'm not doing that for other people. So he says no, like Bistama, and after Pelush, even the person says, I now accept that it's Shabbat for me and my wife. This is Moshe Feinstein, you haven't done anything. You accept Shabbat for you. She can accept Shabbat for herself. However, יש מקום לאוסרה במלאכה ולצורך הבעל כגון לבשל עבורו מהדין דווי נפש בין המתך. Okay, so basically he says maybe at the end of the day it's not proper at that point. The husband's accepted Shabbat, the wife's going to still be cooking or doing melacha that's involved for putting food on the hot plate, whatever. That's for the house, and that should be now at a state of rest, and he's accepted Shabbat. It says maybe not, but certainly. But he says Mikara din. Husband's accepted Shabbat. The wife has not yet accepted Shabbat. Yes.
That's a different meaning than if I meet somebody, it's Tosefet Shabbat, and I say to him, do me a favor, go to my house. I forgot my wife put stuff on the hot plate. You can ask somebody else. You can't ask your wife. This, if you've accepted Shabbat, she can't cook for you.
So again, he says right. So he says again, that ulai yesh makom le'osra. He says maybe there's room to do, but he's not. It's not clear cut. But yeah. That is Rav Moshe Feinstein. Now, on the other hand, we have Rav Osna Shevet HaLevi, who has a different opinion on this. He says he understands, and there are other poskim who agree with him, that when the husband accepts Shabbat, now that is not just his acceptance of Shabbat, but essentially that is the household's acceptance of Shabbat. And therefore, at that point, wife would be bound as well. So you have to know, and you have to work out, and you have to say, I'm going to Mincha at 6:15, and we're going to get to work it out. We're going to get to Mizmor Shir at whatever time. Okay, you can never remember the time, so you have to wait from 1 week to the next, and you have to try and figure it out. Make sure you light candles by that time, so that in order to accept the Tosefet Shabbat, that is the Ashkenazi machloket. Amongst the Sephardi poskim, we find a similar machloket. Chazon Avadia, number 57. He says, "Chen habal shekibel Shabbat mibod yom eina isha negelet achalav mutelet b'asiyat melacha b'anakat nerot Shabbat." She can still light candles even after the husband has accepted Shabbat. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, source number 58, disagrees. He holds like the Shevet HaLevi. So we have Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Avadia Yosef, very significant poskim of the last generation, this generation, saying that no, the husband's acceptance of Shabbat does not obligate the wife as well. On the other hand, Shevet HaLevi, Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, who are also very significant poskim, who say no. Bottom line is, everybody would agree that it's not appropriate if you're doing early Shabbat. Now the husband walks home from shul and he walks in and the house is still completely whole and the candles haven't been lit. That is not appropriate. I mean, the candles should be lit by the time when the husband walks home and walks into the house. It's already Shabbat. By that point, it should be. If it's a few minutes, before and after, it doesn't have to be exactly the same time. But as we've seen, that is a machloket. It's exactly at that moment when the husband accepts Shabbat. Does the wife have to accept it at that point as well? But it should be, more or less in the same region, right, before he comes home. Okay. And then finally on this topic, the question of reciting Kriyat Shema after nightfall and beginning the meal. So as we saw, for whatever purposes we say Tosefet Shabbat, we've extended the day. We can daven Mariv early, etc. One thing we cannot do until nightfall is Kriyat Shema. Kriyat Shema is a mitzvah b'shach b'cha u'v'kumecha. Ram Brachot discusses exactly what the first Mishnah in first Mishnah in Shas already talks about. What is the time of saying Shema at nightfall? And everybody agrees Shema is after nightfall, and that is a mitzvah d'oraita. So even if we've davened earlier, and even if we've accepted Shabbat earlier, as we mentioned previously, we have to repeat Kriyat Shema. Now, this raises another issue, which is that Chazal said when the time comes to say Kriyat Shema, so half an hour before that time, one should not engage in certain activities, certain time-consuming activities, one of those being a meal, because we're concerned that a person's going to start eating, and the meal's going to drag on, and whatever's going to happen, and by the time it's finished, you're going to fall asleep, and you won't have said Kriyat Shema of nighttime. So therefore, before half an hour, we're not worried. There's only when we get to that range of time of half an hour, that's when we say, now, the obligation is incumbent upon you. You have to think about it, and you shouldn't do things which will distract you. So the question is, and this is very relevant, a person gets home, a person does early Shabbat, gets home, and it's now within that, if it's before half an hour before nightfall, so you start the meal, and then you'll say Shema afterwards, and that is fine. And that's another reason why a person should make Kiddush as soon as possible after coming home. In any event, the poskim write that one should make Kiddush as soon as possible after coming home and beginning Shabbat. But person comes home, it's getting a little bit late, you're not quite ready yet, and it's now within half an hour before nightfall. So you haven't said Kriyat Shema. You can't say Kriyat Shema now because it's not yet nightfall, but can you start the meal? On the other hand, if you say, well, we have to wait until it gets night and then say Shema and then start the meals, then what's the point of doing? It's the point of doing early Shabbos. The whole reason you did it was because you want to start them early, right? So, says the Shulchan Aruch, source number 59. He says, one cannot, this is just in general, this is not necessarily on Shabbat. One cannot eat, the default position is, one cannot start a meal half an hour before the time of Kriyat Shema. Now, there are certain exceptions. One of the exceptions is if you have a shomer, you have somebody who's going to remind you, or you could say if you have an alarm clock. On Shabbat, it's a bit more tricky to have an alarm clock because then you're not going to be able to turn it off, and whether you can turn it on or not, that's a discussion. But so let's see, the Mishnah Berurah, number 60. He says, "Im itchil be'eter, dayinu lefnei chatzi sha'a shesmucha letzet hakochavim, afilu l'kriyat shema eino mafsik." You started earlier, before half an hour, that's fine. You eat your meal. You don't have to stop your meal to say Kriyat Shema, but you should say it. You should say it afterwards. Now, what happens on Shabbat? As I've said, you get home. There's less than half an hour before the time for Kriyat Shema. Can you start the meal? So he says, number 61. So after you've davened Mariv, and now you have less than half an hour before nightfall, so ideally, says the Mishnah Berurah, don't start eating yet. Says rather wait till night, say Kriyat Shema, and then start eating. Because you can't say Kriyat Shema earlier. Okay, the Mishnah Berurah is yesh lo ami lismoch is not to be scoffed at, but he says therefore if you are lenient in this regard, says ideally again you should either start the meal before half an hour or you should wait till nightfall, say Kriyat Shema, and then start. But he says, if you are lenient, i.e., it's less than half an hour, and you begin, he says, we won't protest against this. There are opinions on which to rely on for this, various reasons. As I said, the best thing to do is if somebody has something which is going to remind them. Well, people have a practice, or in many homes, when in the summer, when you know that every week we're coming to shul early, we have to say Kriyat Shema, so it becomes part of the thing. When you get to benching, you get to the end of the meal, you say, okay, we're going to bench before Shema or after Shema or after benching, but everybody says like Kriyat Shema at the table. Make sure you don't forget. That would be another way. That would
have some kind of a simmer, whether it's a little petek or something, anything that reminds you. Then it's okay.
Yeah. That would work. And as I said as well, if part of this is a bit of a contradiction here, because if we're saying, especially sometimes people find it when it gets Shabbos, when it gets dark very late, people find it difficult to wait till late at night, you have young children or not, or whatever it is. So you're going to bring in the early Shabbos and then go home and then wait till nightfall, and you'll still make a bit of time, but it almost defeats the purpose. And therefore, there is, as we've seen, is what to rely on. You have some sort of a siman, something to remind you. If that's your usual practice, then that would be okay. Yeah, sure.
What's he getting at here with this Mandish to law?
Oh no, so he's just saying that when we say Kriyat Shema, again, the truth, put Kriyat Shema is somewhat of an anomaly. Normally, when we have a mitzvah and we have a bracha that we have to recite before it, so we can't. So we need to say the bracha and then do the mitzvah. Because Kriyat Shema bichlal, we have the brachot that we say before and after Shema, both in Shachrit and in Arvit. And one of the ways we know that is not a regular Birkat mitzvah is because the time, say for Shachrit even, you can only say Kriyat Shema until 3 hours, but Birkot Kriyat Shema, you can say until 4 hours. So you can even say them at the time when you're not fulfilling the mitzvah. So it's a different idea. It's more to do with tefillah, less to do with the mitzvah necessarily. But you might have thought that if I've not fulfilled the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema and Arvit, so later on when I'm fulfilling the mitzvah, I would have to say the brachot as well. He's saying no, we don't repeat the brachot that you say as part of Mariv. That you don't have to repeat, but it's just the Kriyat Shema itself. That is what we say. Yeah.
No, I'm just finding it's possibly off the point. We have a practice in our family of doing Kriyat Shema al HaMitzvah, all 3 paragraphs, and so nobody in our family say earlier. But if someone had visitors, we like stop in the middle of the meal and declare now is the time for Kriyat Shema and say it.
Yes, man, Kriyat Shema.
You're wrong.
I don't understand.
It's like sort of wasting up from there.
So, who's saying that? The guest? Is that the guest or the host?
Yes.
Okay, so I would suggest to the guest not to do that.
Yeah.
Again, you don't have to stop in the middle of the meal. It's fine to say it afterwards at the end. What you said about Kriyat Shema Mitzvah, it's based on Rashi. It says that we fulfill the mitzvah when we say Kriyat Shema Mitzvah as well. And there's a discussion that poskim is 1 paragraph required, or 3 paragraphs required. But it's a good practice. It's a good way to be safe. If your practice is always to say all 3, this is why some people have to practice. Say all 3 paragraphs of Kriyat Shema Mitzvah. That way, even if I've forgotten or whatever it is, I won't forget because I have it there as part of my habit. Okay. Adkan, we have completed now Tosefet Shabbat next week. B'ezrat Hashem, we're on Shabbat already. It only took us about 6 or 7 weeks to get there. We'll begin with the Tefillot of Shabbat, and from there we'll move on, chronologically through Einat onto Shabbat day. Shakach, everyone. Have a good day.